Okay, so we're just gonna have a collective moment of transparency right up here at the front of this video. Due to the recent state of, well, everything over the last month or so, I've been finding it really hard to be creative lately. So in other words, this is gonna be a bit of a departure from my usual style. Basically, all I really want to do for you today is to tell you a story about one of the most bland, right down the middle, 5 out of 10 anime series I have ever seen. But it did have one shocking moment of glory sprinkled in that made it almost a decade later still one of the most memorable viewing experiences I've ever had. Now, I do realize that description alone doesn't really make it sound like the story merits dedicating an entire video to it. But you see, there's also this philosophical conundrum at the heart of this story that I've never really been able to reconcile with either. The problem is, although the title of this video may be How to Recommend Bad Anime, that's really more of a question than it is an outright statement. Because while watching this series for the first time is something that has stuck with me for many years now, I also have no idea how to actually recommend it to anyone without simultaneously ruining the experience for them in the process. See, we're already getting into tricky territory here with this one. Basically, the gist of the issue here is that what made my viewing experience so impactful was a sudden shift in tone and content at the conclusion of the series. So, technically speaking, even just saying the name of this show will in some way be spoiling it for you. Because you will now know that if you ever do decide to watch this particular anime, there's going to be an abrupt change in style waiting for you at the end of it. Simply possessing this knowledge will inevitably lessen the impact of the finale for you. It's like Schrodinger's spoiler or something. On top of that, this is something that I find particularly galling for me personally because, I've never really considered myself someone who cares about spoilers. Quite the opposite, in fact. And I realize for a lot of people that's probably not a popular opinion, so I've always tried to respect everyone's preferences and use spoiler warnings within my own videos, or even when just talking with friends. But generally speaking, I've usually found any piece of media that solely relies on third act twists or shock value to stand out usually just leave me feeling like it was a pretty hollow experience overall. And yet, despite that fact, this story is probably the only exception to that rule I've ever encountered before. And so hopefully now you understand why I don't really know how to talk about this anymore without, just spoiling the damn thing. So I guess if you are someone who is so intensely spoiler phobic that even the idea of a fairly mundane anime watching experience is ruined for you bothers you, well, then I guess this is the point of the video where you just get off the ride. But for the rest of you, just trust me on this one, okay? You're not really missing out on much here. This series is so long and just so average that I'm not convinced the prize at the end of the journey is even really worth it. Plus, I mean, if I do a good job here, this video might actually serve as a good substitution for watching the show altogether. But just so we're all on the same page here, this isn't going to be anywhere near as meticulously written, and it certainly isn't going to be as heavily researched as most of my other videos have been. But if you are willing to stick with me through to the end of this one, I think we'll still end on a note worthy of your time all the same. And so with all that out of the way, let's talk about the most average anime series I have ever seen. Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle. Alright, so before we dive headfirst into the story, why don't I give you a quick summary about what Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle is even about. So on paper, Tsubasa sounds like a pretty neat little high-concept fantasy show. Our two protagonists for the series are Princess Sakura and her childhood friend Shaoran. And as a quick side note, if those names and character designs are starting to look and sound a bit familiar to you, well, it's because the original manga was written by Clamp, the four-woman team that is probably most famous for also creating the wildly successful Cardcaptor Sakura. Just keep that in mind. It'll be important later, I promise. Now, the dynamic between our two leads here is that Sakura pretty blatantly has a thing for Shaoran, and despite his best efforts to hide it, he clearly feels the same way. But of course, the reason Shaoran continually tries to play off this attraction is because, well, it just simply wouldn't be appropriate for the son of a lowly archaeologist to get romantically involved with royalty, now would it? But unfortunately for both of them, there's not really a lot of time for the show to milk that juicy tension for all it's worth. Because after some mystical tomfoolery goes down in a nearby ruin that Shaoran is exploring, Sakura ends up losing all of her memories in the form of these magical feathers, which get scattered across numerous alternate dimensions and realities. And to make matters worse, without any of her memories, Sakura falls into a near comatose state, and if someone doesn't start restoring her memories soon, she's going to die. Thankfully though, Shaoran isn't the kind of guy to just sit around and let that happen, so he seeks out the help of a dimensional witch named Yuko, who can grant him the ability to travel between worlds in search of Sakura's lost feathers. But because the ladies at Clamp know a thing or two about how to write a good story, Yuko can't just give Shaoran this power for free. No, if he wants a chance to save Sakura, then he must also give up something of equal value. As Yuko puts it, he must trade in his most prized possession, which for Shaoran is tragically his relationship with Sakura, meaning even if he is able to retrieve every last one of Sakura's feathers, she will still never regain any of her memories about him. But of course, being the noble hero protagonist that he is, Shaoran quickly agrees to the deal all the same, and so the two of them set off on their journey, also accompanied by a magician named Fai and a feudal swordsman named Kurogane. So not only did this series have the pedigree of being based on a manga written by award-winning artists, it also had a pretty intriguing premise as well. Unfortunately, as we'll be getting into a little bit later in the video, none of this potential was ever taken full advantage of in the anime that we actually got. But for now, let's get back to one of my favorite topics of conversation, me. So to kick off my story in earnest, I need to take you all the way back to the year 2011.
It's Friday, gotta get down on Friday.
Now, while I don't know exactly what you were doing at the same time, I can tell you that for me, this was the summer in between my sophomore and junior years of college. And all things considered, things were going pretty great. Unlike the previous year where I had been living in the on-campus dorms where they basically just kick you out at the end of the semester, I was now living in an off-campus apartment, which also meant I no longer had to make that 150-mile move back to my hometown for the summer. And that was great news, because based on some turbulent family situations going on back at the homestead, visiting my family for any amount of time was something I quite frankly had very little interest in doing. Instead, I got to hang out with my roommates, and since it was the summer now and we no longer had any classes to go to, we basically got to treat every day like it was the weekend. So, like I said, things were going pretty great. At least for a little while, that is. Slowly but surely as the weeks wore on, all of my roommates, as well as basically all of my friends I didn't live with as well, started making their way back to their respective hometowns. Until eventually by late June, it was pretty much just me sitting in a 4-bedroom apartment by myself. And look, I'm an introvert by nature, so a little alone time was hardly the worst thing that could happen to me. But I did still need to find a way to pass the time, which is what eventually led me to breaking this bad boy back out. The complete series of Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicles on Blu-ray. Now to give you even more background information here, I had actually tried to watch Tsubasa a few months earlier in the middle of the spring semester. For most of the year, me and my roommates had actually made a habit of watching through a bunch of different anime series during our downtime, and I sort of just bought this on a whim after seeing a trailer for it before one of the other shows we had been watching. Plus, it was pretty cheap, only around $30 or so on Amazon if I remember correctly. So paying that little for over 50 plus episodes of anime seemed like too good of a bargain to pass up on. I guess that part of me never really changed, huh? So once my roommates and I had finished whatever show we had previously been watching, I sort of just made the executive decision that it was finally time to give Tsubasa a try. But, well, that didn't last very long. I'd say we probably made it, 9 or 10 episodes in, but eventually we all just sort of dropped off. And to be fair to the show, it probably wasn't entirely its fault. Like I said earlier, we were reaching the end of the spring semester and, finals were coming up and we were just a lot busier than we usually were. But if we fast forward a few months, I'm now sitting alone on the couch and I got nothing but free time on my hands. So I decided I should finally try and give this show the shot it really deserved. Or, at least try and get my money's worth out of it. And I suppose this is also the point in the video where I want to explain to you why I'm going into such great detail about the setting and mindset I was in when I first watched the series. Because I promise it is going to be relevant information down the road. Like, it is going to be important information for you to know that I very literally had nothing better to do with my time. And so to that point, there is still one last little detail I want to fill you in on before we start talking about the show itself. Which is, not only does this story take place during the summer months, but it was specifically in Oklahoma summer. Which meant it was hot. Like really, really hot. And since I lived in a really crappy apartment where the management company was clearly trying to take advantage of a bunch of college kids, I basically couldn't run the air conditioning at all. Like, this isn't hyperbole here. I literally kept the temperature at 85 degrees, and I still got an overage charge. Not the full bill, an overage charge of $200 for that month. So yeah, something fishy was definitely going on there. But now, taking into consideration everything that I've told you up until this point, hopefully I've also accurately painted the proper picture for you. I need you to understand, I'm sitting there alone in the middle of this 4-bedroom apartment. It's ungodly hot. The windows wide open, ceiling fans running constantly, and I just need something, anything to help me kill time. And folks, I gotta say, I know up until this point I haven't had very many nice things to say about Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle, but let me be the first to admit, one thing that show was absolutely great at was eating up time. Sadly though, I was also quickly reminded of why the show never really hooked us on the first go around either. Like, there's a lot of different ways I could try and describe it for you, but when you really get down to it, despite the show's fairly interesting setup, really its biggest problem is that it's just oppressively bland. For instance, you would think the premise of jumping from world to world would keep things feeling fresh and new on a regular basis. After all, if you don't like one episode, well, don't worry, because things are bound to change once the team travels to the next dimension, right? Well, not really. You see, the problem is that it takes Tsubasa the first 11 episodes to get through just count 'em, 2 worlds, and they're not even very interesting worlds at that. Like, the first one is sort of just a riff on a Pokemon-style kids show where everyone is using these magical familiars to battle one another, and the second world is just your typical historical fantasy setting with a bit of magic thrown in. And sure, if these were just 1 or 2 episodes, you could find a way to make even the most basic premise interesting, but when it's taking you 5 or 6 episodes to get through just 1 memory feather apiece, well, it makes the pacing of the show feel like it's moving at an absolute crawl. And look, I don't want to turn this video into just a 20-minute rant about the show I didn't like very much. Plus, I mean, it's not like it was completely terrible all the way through either. I specifically remember the arc where the group gets split into 2 factions that magically get transported to this castle in the sky to do battle every night, which was, if nothing else, visually really stunning. But then again, you do also have that insufferable dragonfly racing arc, and wait, I said I wasn't going to do this. Okay, so the larger point I was trying to get at with this is, well, I definitely think it is true that due to the specific living situation I found myself in at the time, I was probably more willing to put up with this mediocre show than I would have been under normal circumstances. I guess I just started to get this feeling like there was something more to this series that was hidden just below the surface. Like there was this much better version of the show frantically trying to scratch and claw its way onto my television screen. I first remember thinking this around the arc where the gang gets trapped in a virtual reality game, and you meet this mysterious character from Shaoran's past. And on top of this, as the series goes along, you continue to get these little glimpses, usually at the culmination of each world, of this clearly antagonistic duo who are keeping tabs on our heroes, as well as multiple shots of this other Shaoran with an eye patch floating in some magical crystal tank thing. So clearly there was some larger story going on in the background that, was presumably going to start cropping up more and more over time. I guess I just started thinking that perhaps that better show I'd been hoping for was actually right around the corner, maybe even in the very next episode. Somehow, against my better judgment, the show had still managed to hook me. And so with this newly found resolve, I just started chewing through episodes. But, of course, that better show I had been hoping for never really showed up. There was the movie that takes place in between the 2 seasons that was animated by Production IG instead of the usual animation studio, so at least it actually looked good for once. But it's also barely longer than a normal episode, so the actual content was mostly just more of the same. Eventually, I did make it to the final disc, and, well, like I said, at this point, I was just tearing through episodes at a pretty rapid pace, so I wasn't even really keeping track of how many episodes I had left until I reached the end. I kinda just kept waiting in anticipation as we approached what was supposedly the series finale. And then I finally made it to the last episode, and, well, it just sorta ends.
Here we are, safely in the next world.
Well, I wonder what kind of place it is this time.
Why don't we stop asking questions and find out?
Well, what do you say?
I say, let's get going.
Hope you had a great time with us, everybody. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.
There's no big conclusion, no grand revelations. It just ends more or less like any other episode. And well, I was feeling a lot of different emotions at the time. I was frustrated, disappointed. Really, I just didn't even know what to think anymore about this show that I had, at this point, invested a lot of time into and essentially didn't get anything out of. And then on top of all that, when you add in all the extra circumstances outside of me just literally watching the show, and, well, I guess you could just say at this point, I was not at the best particular moment in my life. In previously researching if I should even buy the complete series box set in the first place, I had seen that there were 2 additional sets of OVAs sold separately, but I'd been waiting to finish the main series before I made any decisions about whether I should watch those as well. And yeah, since finishing the show had left such a bad impression on me, I had kinda just sworn off watching any more of this garbage right then and there. But if we fast forward the story about a week or so later, my situation had sort of changed. By now, it was the beginning of July. I know this because I had finally given in and reluctantly decided to go home over the 4th of July holiday. And for the record, things were relatively fine on the family front. Like, I don't remember any extra drama that came out of that particular trip home. But there was still a separate issue that I was having to contend with. You see, the previous summer when I had moved back to college, I had sort of made it my secret mission to take anything of value with me. You know, just in case I never ended up coming back home again. Which in turn meant, although I was finally able to enjoy the comforts of free air conditioning and free food for the first time in a little while, I also didn't really have a whole lot to do either. I once again found myself alone, this time in my childhood bedroom, with nothing to keep me occupied except for my laptop. And so it was at this point that I finally gave in. I made my way over to Funimation's official website, and I hit play on the first Tsubasa OVA. And folks, I am being absolutely 100% serious here when I say that it blew my mind. And now that I've hopefully gotten you all excited with that shocking revelation, this is yet another point in the video where I need to hit pause and give you one last info dump, this time about the actual production of Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle. So remember earlier when I mentioned that the manga Tsubasa was adapted from was written by Clamp? Well, this is where that starts to factor back in. Because, as I also noted, Clamp's most famous creation was Cardcaptor Sakura, and when Tsubasa finally hit Japanese televisions, it inherited Cardcaptor's old time slot as well. The problem is, the manga that Clamp wrote for Tsubasa had content that was far more mature than the content of their previous hit, which ultimately resulted in the TV station NHK forcing the content of the Tsubasa anime to be heavily edited down and sanitized to appeal to a much younger demographic. Essentially, NHK was dead set on creating another Cardcaptor Sakura-sized cash cow, but as this video has already highlighted, you can't turn a bull into a cow just by panning spots on it. Tensions between NHK and Clamp got so bad leading into the second season that the planned third and final season, which would have actually wrapped up the story, just got cancelled altogether. And as I later found out, starting with episode 42, none of the content of the show is even based on anything in the manga at all. They basically just had to come up with enough story to cover 10 more episodes, so the season could get to its previously allotted total of 26, and then everyone could finally just wipe their hands of the whole deal and move on with their lives. And as disappointing as these revelations were, they at least were a good explanation as to why I had been getting these strange feelings while actually watching Tsubasa as well. There was a better version of the story out there, it's just that it only existed in manga form. Well, that is, for the most part. Once the TV show had finally limped across the finish line, Clamp made arrangements to have Production IG produce those 2 sets of OVAs I mentioned earlier, which were then packaged as part of premium releases of the accompanying manga chapters. The OVAs would specifically focus on 2 of the more pivotal segments still left in the story, and in case you hadn't already guessed it, the OVAs no longer had to abide by the same restrictions that the television show had. Like, just take a look at what happens in the initial 5 minutes of the first OVA. And while, sure, by anime standards, someone getting shot through the leg with an arrow is pretty tame, but you have to remember what all the other episodes I had just slogged through were like. Compared to that, this was basically torture porn, and believe me, it was just the beginning. The whole first arc takes place in a post-apocalyptic Tokyo where acid rain is destroying everything. There are vampire twins, giant mutant earthworms, and lots of blood. For Christ's sakes, at one point, a man literally rips another man's eyeball out of his head and then eats it, because apparently that's how magical powers are transferred in this world. And so I was sitting there alone watching all this, and I was losing my damned mind. I was near hysterical, lost in an anime-fueled moment of absolute ecstasy. And for the record, I am by no means someone who can only enjoy something if it's violent or edgy, but after enduring 52 episodes of utter mundanity, I was practically begging for more bloodshed. It was like finally listening to a song mixed in stereo with both channels on. It was like watching a movie and switching from standard to high definition. Everything was finally coming into focus for me. Finally, that show that I knew in my heart had to be out there in the ether somewhere. Finally, it was here in front of me on my television screen, and man, it was glorious. If I wanted to be overly critical, the second set of OVAs were a little less impressive, mostly because it just dove headfirst into the most convoluted portions of the story's plot. After all, these were being packaged with chapters of the manga, so it was assumed that the viewer already had a working knowledge of the events that took place in between the two OVAs. But I mean, really, I was still riding that initial high from the first OVA, so really, you probably could have just shown me security camera footage from a Banana Republic in Butte, Montana, and I would have told you it deserved an Oscar. But there was also one last cruel joke this series had up its sleeve, because as much of an improvement as the OVAs were compared to the original series, they still never actually covered the conclusion to this story. Which on one hand was certainly disappointing, but at the same time, more than anything, the feeling I remember is just joy and relief at finally being able to wholeheartedly like something related to this series. And to be fair, going back to these OVAs in preparation for this video, they obviously didn't have anywhere near the same impact for me they did the first time around. But in the moment, it suddenly felt like all of that time that I had invested in this series had finally paid off. In some small way, it was finally worth it. And so with that, we've reached the end of my little story here. But there is still one last question left to be answered. What was the point of me telling you all this anyway? You know, I've always hated that question of what piece of media would you magically erase from your memory so that you could go back and experience it for the first time. And I promise I'm not trying to be overly pedantic with this. I do realize it's just meant to be a fun hypothetical. But I also think it's one of those things that implicitly reinforces this idea that it's possible to watch the media we engage with in a vacuum, which it's not. Like, if I wipe all knowledge of Tsubasa from my memory and try to rewatch it, do I also get magically transported back to that muggy college apartment in 2011? Because if not, well then it ain't gonna hit the same way for me again. In the end, what was more important to my enjoyment of the show? The actual content of the episodes, or the environment that I watched them in? Well, the truth is, I don't think you can really just separate the two of them like that. They're both two halves of the whole that make up my personal viewing experience. Like, sure, I ended up getting something out of the show in the long run, but it's still really hard for me to say that anyone else should watch the show. Are you stuck in a spiraling depression that you're not even willing to admit right now? Are you stuck in a sweatbox apartment with nothing better to occupy your time? Well then, buddy, have I got the perfect show for you. But I mean, seriously, there's a reason why I only rewatched the OVAs in preparation for this video. I don't want to go back and rewatch those other 52 episodes. I got better things to do with my time. So then how in good conscience could I ever recommend that someone else put in that kind of time investment when I'm not even willing to do it myself? But then, what is my final takeaway from all this? What is the moral to this story here? Well, I do understand this is probably a bit ironic coming from the guy who made a 90-minute video on Evangelion talking about how one of the most special things art does is connect us to one another. But I think this is also an important, not necessarily counter-argument, but maybe just something we should also always try and keep in mind. And that's that it's okay if sometimes a piece of media and our love of that piece of media is really just for us. Far too often these days, we define ourselves by the art that we enjoy. It molds and shapes our friend groups, our perspectives on the world, and sometimes, even for both good and bad, our own self-identities. These pieces, these totems to our passions, these stories that we love, they mean so much to us that we want to be able to share them with each other. But the truth is, some things just can't be shared with anyone other than ourselves. I'm likely never going to be able to recreate that same feeling I had watching Tsubasa the first time around, because I'm not at that same place in my life, both literally and figuratively. I'm just not that same person anymore. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. It means I've moved on, I've grown as a person. But that doesn't also mean you have to completely forget your past as well. I may never rewatch the show again for as long as I live, but I also don't think I'll ever get rid of this box set either. Because while it'll never elicit that same feeling as before, it's a nice memento of where I've been and how far I've come. A roadmap for a path charted and traveled only by me. And while it does feel like a bit of a shame that I can never retake that journey with someone else, or, I guess basically even by myself at this point, that doesn't really bother me anymore either. Instead, I choose to look at the bright side of things, like, hey, at least I got a good story out of it. Hey, thanks for watching this departure from my usual style. Hopefully it'll be back to business as usual with my next video. And since you're one of the few people that stuck around for the credits, I assume you either fell asleep due to sheer boredom, or you actually really enjoyed the video. And if you're part of that latter group, perhaps you'd like to consider supporting me over on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you get a bunch of extra bonuses, like early access to videos, monthly Q&As, as well as bonus videos whenever I find the time. And if you don't have $1 to spare, well then you can always help out by engaging in the time-honored YouTube tradition of liking, commenting, and or sharing. Alright, that's all I have for you today, so until next time I'll just say my name's Drew, and you've been watching Select Screen.